Hey there, friend. If you went to business school, you were probably taught, like I was, that operational excellence is not a source of competitive advantage. And that's what getting your MBA is all about. That's what being a leader is all about, is looking for durable competitive advantage. And the reason they say operational excellence doesn't fall into that category is because, well, it's just too easy to copy. And the real game is strategy. Your goal is to run a different race, not just a faster one. And that's the analogy that got beat into my head, that operational excellence is running the same race as everyone else, but just doing it faster. And I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense. And I believed it. And with many clients that we've been working with, I introduced some version of that to help them. And then recently, I read a study of over 12,000 companies across 34 countries that stopped me cold. And this came from a conversation I was having with one individual named Joey DeMarie, a former McKinsey consultant. And he noted that the data says most companies never get the operational basics right. And the article says the ones that do hold that advantage for years. So today we're digging into what that means for your construction or lumber and building material business, especially if you're family owned. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Construction Leadership Podcast, where we help construction executives lead high-performing teams that finish on time and under budget without all the firefighting and babysitting, so you can lead with focus and control. I am your host, Bradley Hartman. Now, here's a lesson that I have learned multiple times in life, currently in this exact moment as well. I am taught something. I am introduced to an idea by someone I admire. I do some research, and this confirms why what this thing means is actually true in the world. And I say, that's it. All right. This is a lesson for living. This is how the world operates. And then time goes on, and I find that maybe it's wrong, or maybe it's incomplete, or it's worth further consideration, or maybe some version of all three. And the lesson that is relevant here is this. You cannot build a durable, sustainable, competitive advantage on operational excellence. And if the question is, well, why is that? It's because the operations are too easy to copy. And any efficiency that you create, any new process you implement, or any system you build into your operations, a competitor can see it and easily replicate it. So the real game, the thinking goes, is strategy. Strategy is the how. How do we do it? How do we get specific? And how do we make that unique? And the goal here is to stake out a distinctive position in the market, doing something completely different than your rivals, not just doing things better. And there's an icon of this thinking. This guy who introduced this idea is Michael Porter. He's kind of a legend in strategy circles, and he articulated this exact idea in the 1996 Harvard Business Review article. What is strategy? And therefore, it became gospel in almost every single MBA program, and it's strategy over operations. And here's what I've learned. That is probably wrong. And while no one is going to argue strategy is not important, for many of the clients we work with and friends of ours in the construction industry, they would all be better served by focusing on operational excellence. So as I mentioned, I was talking to this former McKinsey consultant named Joey DeMarie, and he said, oh man, you got to read this article. It is called, Why Do We Undervalue Competent Management? And the subhead is, Neither great leadership nor brilliant strategy matters without operational excellence. And it was written by Rafaela Sidun, Nicholas Bloom, and John Van Reenen. And it came out in the September-October 2017 edition of the Harvard Business Review. So what really jumped out to me in this article and what I'm taking away and why I'm sharing it with my clients is this. We need to change our thinking from operational excellence. Yes, everyone can have it. We can't focus just on that because that's table stakes. To that is true. And it should be table stakes, but it's not. And therefore, what might seem to be table stakes could be your edge. It could represent your durable competitive advantage. So this team of researchers from some places you have probably heard about that generally produce insightful people, Harvard, Stanford, and MIT, they spent the better part of 2 decades studying management practices across more than 12,000 companies in 34 countries. And they weren't studying bold strategic moves. They were studying the blocking and tackling, the boring stuff, target setting, performance monitoring, talent management, lean operations. And what they found should get the attention of every one of us in the construction industry. They found that companies that executed these basic management practices well significantly outperformed those that didn't. And moving a firm from the bottom 10% to the top 10% of management practices was associated with $15 million more in profit, 25% faster annual growth, and 75% higher productivity. And here's the best part, is these gaps persisted over time. So it wasn't actually true. If you have these processes and systems really defined and disciplined and performed repeatedly over time in a predictable fashion, this idea that other companies could just do the same thing, false. These gaps persisted over time. Turns out the well-managed companies didn't get copied. The poorly managed companies didn't catch up. The researchers concluded that competent management is actually harder to imitate than Porter gave them credit for. And this is exactly what my team and I are seeing right now with several of our clients. It's these basic processes of effective management. Is everyone clear on the goals that we set for the organization and the individual? Do we all believe that the incentives that are in place will allow us to better serve the customer or reinforce existing silos that we have? Do we feel that the compensation structure is clear and we believe that will ultimately help us all collaborate to achieve our goals while, yes, serving our customers better and taking market share? These things that are so foundational are not being done consistently. And what I believe to be true over the last 5 years in the market that we've seen that had some highs and is a little softer now, we see executives and high-level managers who want to focus on more exciting, interesting stuff. Let's go acquire a new company. That's fun. Let's have a new social media strategy, or let's hire a new advertising firm, or let's launch a new product. All of that is fun. You know what isn't fun? Actually, the blocking and tackling. If you ever played football and you knew something called the hamburger drill, that was all about blocking and tackling. Nobody liked that. I mean, it was fine if you liked violence, but being a tall, skinny quarterback, I didn't like that at all. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do some fun stuff. I wanted to throw a Hail Mary. Let's practice that stuff. And what I believe is that executives have not made the commitment to ensure that these processes are driven down through the organization to give ourselves a chance to have a durable competitive advantage that is operational excellence. And if I have to think of the most common example that fits this, I would go to lean manufacturing. So the Toyota production system has been around for what? I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years. And people know what these things are. And we can talk about Kanban and we can talk about the 8 different types of waste. But how many companies have truly become religious to make it a durable competitive advantage to minimize waste regardless of department? It's been studied, written about, replicated in textbooks, taught in every major MBA program. And yet, how many companies do you know who executed anywhere close to the level that Toyota does, whether in Japan or in the United States? And last September, we saw this firsthand as our lumber and building material sales analytics membership group. We got a tour of the Toyota production facility in San Antonio, and we saw it in action. And how many companies were doing anything remotely close to that? The answer? A few, if any. Because knowing what to do and actually building the organizational discipline to do it are 2 completely different things. And that's what these researchers mean when they say there are differences in process quality and they represent a barrier to imitation. We talk a lot about barriers to entry in business, and actually that comes from Michael Porter's 5 forces. But a barrier to imitation, the idea that even if you tell competitors exactly what you're doing, they still can't replicate it. Now that's a genuine competitive advantage. And it's sitting right here for you to begin if you're willing to build it. And every single week, I see this gap that these researchers describe in our own industry. The researchers identified 18 specific management practices across 4 categories: operations management, performance monitoring, target setting, and talent management. Now, I'm not going to run through all 18 for these 4 categories, but what I will tell you is you should go to our show notes to download this article and review those. In the lumber and building material and construction companies that we work with, trying to help them grow market share and be more systematic in the way they grow their business, either with sales or business development, that's the one that jumps off the page for me. Most of them do not have a consistent sales process. Everyone kind of does their own thing. The top rep has their own little system. The middle rep does his own little set of things. The new rep has no system, and they just say, well, it's kind of sink or swim around here. And leadership sort of tolerates this behavior because the top rep is hitting their number, so why rock the boat? And what we end up is a series of sales processes. The machine is working exactly as it is designed, but everyone's kind of doing their own thing. And this is exactly the kind of management gap this research is documenting. And here's what it means practically. You're building your revenue on individual heroics rather than a predictable, repeatable process. You're building a system around an individual who may leave or may retire or, unfortunately, might get hit by a dump truck. And what you want to do is you want to build a system around roles, not an individual talent. Now, here's one fact from this article that really stood out to me, and it was somewhat counterintuitive. They said the better managed firms in the study were spending 10 times more on R&D, on research and development, and generating 10 times more patents as their poorly managed peers. Now, think about that for a moment. In my mind, if you're really focused on operations and really focused on processes and these internal things on how we collaborate, it doesn't really lead to innovation. Innovation comes from other companies that are really focused on the messy process of creativity. Not so fast. Turns out the companies that were intensely focused on process discipline, operational excellence, that is, not exactly the most exciting brand identity in the market, were actually more innovative than their less disciplined counterparts. And as I thought more about it, I flashed back to some really high-performing teams and companies that we worked for in the past. And what we found is when the operations are really tight, they free up 2 things, time and capital. You're not constantly firefighting. You're not hemorrhaging margin through all the inefficiency, having constant turnover, putting out fires, or babysitting people. And that creates time and space to listen to your customer base and invest in what comes next to help them. So it makes sense to me that the companies that say they don't have time or budget for any sort of innovation, maybe the real issue is that their operational foundation isn't solid enough. They're spending way too much time on firefighting and babysitting to actually generate the resources that innovation requires. So if this data is right in front of us and it seems to make sense, why do leaders avoid this work? Well, the research found that the CEO's personal involvement was the single biggest predictor of whether management improves or not. And what they're saying is when CEOs are personally invested in this work, the humdrum, blocking and tackling, and they get in the weeds and they get focused on it and they ride this initiative, not just something they delegate to the VP of operations, it actually gets done. Another finding fits with human nature is that a staggering number of managers simply can't objectively assess how their organizations are actually run. At the end of every single interview they did, the researchers asked managers to score their own firm's management quality on a scale of 1 to 10. And you can imagine what was happening. Very few people, because they are, by nature of being in this interview, part of the problem. The median answer was 7. And when they compared those self-assessments to actual management scores and actual firm performance vis-a-vis their competition, there was 0 correlation. None. People were overconfident in their ability to be good managers. And this makes sense to me. How many people do you meet with and they say, yeah, compared to my peers or other people around here, I am below average in management? Nobody thinks that. The article notes that 70% of students rate themselves above average, 80% of drivers do the same, and 90% of university professors think the same way. Therefore, we shouldn't be shocked when most managers think their companies are pretty well run. Meanwhile, the data says otherwise. Now, there's one other element here that I want to hit upon that I think would make this article required reading, especially for any leader working in a family-owned businesses. Why? Because if you work in a family-owned business, you're probably worse, not better, than the rest of the organization studied. Across every country and every industry they studied, family-owned firms with a family CEO consistently scored the lowest on management practices. And they found it's not because family businesses can't be excellent. Of course, we know they surely can. It's because introducing rigorous management practices often requires the things that are personally costly to a family owner: hiring outside talent, decentralizing decisions, sharing authority, and ultimately telling Jimmy, your nephew, who's not really good at the thing he was hired to do, that we actually need to identify this, be really direct with him, and tell him that we are coaching and building the organization around him. Those are tough conversations to have. However, the good news is that introducing strong management capabilities doesn't mean having to lose control. What it does mean is that you'll probably have to change your role. The founders who've navigated this well, and yes, I'm including those that we have worked with, they've brought in outside help and have implemented a more rigorous process. What they actually find is this allows them more time to spend in areas of business that they love working on and they're really strong at. So needless to say, the article here is not saying that strategy doesn't matter. It's that we drastically undervalue what type of durable competitive advantage can come from getting your processes and systems locked in, focused on the role, not an individual. And why I've been spending so much time thinking about this article is because the research fundamentally challenges what I was taught, that operational effectiveness is easy to copy and therefore it's not really a source of competitive advantage. And the data says most companies never get there. The gap between really well-managed companies and poorly managed firms is massive, and it persists over time. So as it turns out, running the same race just faster than other people, yeah, over time, it's a really good way to win. So go to the show notes. You'll see a link there to this article that I obviously would recommend to a friend. Why do we undervalue competent management? Download it, read it, apply it to your business. And as always, you are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.